you can do both those things. It's just the intention to do it. So I kind of reject the premise, which people do bring up, is, we need to solve the climate crisis now. And so I need to build renewable energy now, despite the local ecosystem.
Our show, Electric Equity, looks at energy poverty around the globe. We'll unpack energy's central role in human flourishing, introduce you to people that are combating energy poverty, and explore the technologies and ethical issues involved in increasing access for the energy poor. I'm your host and engineering professor, Brian Thomas. Dr. Kayla Garrett is our guest host today. She brings knowledge of the environmental impacts of renewable energy systems to our discussion. I just want to thank you publicly also for all your contributions to the good works that we've done in the area of energy poverty. Thank you for hosting today and bringing your expertise to the table.
Thanks. So on a podcast called Electric Equity, you may be wondering why we're talking about environmental impacts of hydropower, or what are the potential concerns for the environment with something like this. Well, hydropower has been around for a really, really long time, and it is all across our globe at small scale and really, really large scale. As it harnesses flowing water, this means it ultimately interacts with our river ecosystems, the riparian zones, water chemistry. It has a lot to do with our geomorphology, water access, all things of this nature. The list goes on and on and on. There's tons of research around the environmental impacts of hydropower. But the truth is, hydropower is one of the best understood forms of renewable energy. So often, it provides an easy entry as energy access and clean energy access for developing energy in new places. Small hydropower has significant potential for increasing energy access for these reasons. But because of the vast array of environmental impacts, we want to make sure that we are doing it right, we're doing it well, and we're ultimately mitigating the environmental impacts to the people and the environments that we are trying to help with increasing energy access. Since 2016, Shannon Ames has been the executive director of the Low Impact Hydropower Institute. She has significant experience at the intersection of hydropower and environmental impact. Welcome, Shannon. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And we'd love to ask first if you could give us some type of high-level description about what is the Low Impact Hydropower Institute.
Thanks, Kayla. It's a pleasure to be here. The Low Impact Hydropower Institute, we are a nonprofit organization. We've been around for 25 years. We were started at the beginning of the emergence of renewable portfolio standards and renewable energy credit markets, and also coming off of the IUCN's report on dams. And the whole point of LIHI, that's what we call it, Low Impact Hydropower Institute, otherwise known as LIHI, we wanted to create a carrot, an incentive for hydropower to perform the way that environmental groups, and specifically American Rivers back in the day, wanted to see hydropower operate. So up until that point, the relationship between river conservation generally and hydropower generally was one of great animosity. There was a lot of suing each other back and forth and intervening in very aggressive manners to licensing projects. So this was an idea to first define what low impact hydropower means, set clear goals for what each of those components meant, and then for hydropower that could meet that criteria, provide them with some monetary incentives to do so. So now we offer the certification. Once hydropower facilities are certified, they can participate in a number of both regulatory and voluntary renewable energy credit markets. So there's a financial incentive for them to do that. And also being a nonprofit, there are other things that we do, including a lot of education and research. We do research on impacts of hydropower. Our most recent one was on pump storage. We've also done research on reservoir emissions. And then we provide that, I guess you can call it expertise, to policymakers, to anybody who's impacted by hydropower, communities and entities that are involved somehow or another in proposed projects, be it of pump storage or conventional hydropower. And then we also try to do a lot of work with kids and school groups. So we do our best to connect those school groups with low impact certified facilities. We get on site, they learn from operators and hear about both the environmental side and the energy side of those facilities. So it's pretty cool.
There's so much of that that's so needed. And hearing about animosity prior to Low Impact Hydropower Institute and what that might have looked like, considering that it's still a pretty tumultuous relationship, I think, even today. So just imagine what that might have been before is fascinating to me. So we're also curious about what your background is, like what brought you to this work in this space and what is so meaningful about it to you personally.
Sure. Let me start by saying that I was not one of those kids who graduated from college with like a clear idea of what I wanted to do. And I went from one interesting position to another. Eventually, that rather circuitous route took me to working for the Massachusetts Senate senator who was the co-chair of the Environment, Natural Resources, and Agriculture Committee. And I was the staffer working on the committee for her. So I ended up as the staffer working on how hydropower was going to be included, if at all, in the new renewable portfolio standard, which was the first time that I had, met that connection myself, being between the hydropower industry and the environmental groups. And we did come up with a compromise. We got hydropower in there. We put some limits to the amount of hydro that could qualify. But we also paraphrased the Low Impact Hydropower Institute's criteria in the statute. And so now through that statute and through regulation, LIHI certification is required to prove that a hydropower has met the statutory requirements. So that's sort of how I was introduced to LIHI, how I was introduced to hydropower. And it was, I loved it. It was a very fun time. My senator retired, and through another little cascade of events, I ended up working at Brookfield Renewable Energy Group, which is a Canadian-based company. And then when I left there, the ED of LIHI retired, and I was lucky enough to get this position. So it sort of brings together, I think, my environmental background, working on legislation and policy, and then also I got some really grounded work from the hydropower industry perspective also. And so being the ED at LIHI is really a lovely combination of those two things.
Here, Shannon uses the term ED, and she uses this in the context of the Low Impact Hydropower Institute. This is essentially the equivalent of a CEO in the nonprofit world. It's the executive director. This is just one of those differences in terminology, but ED, that's what we're working with here, executive director.
I will also say, because LIHI, our governing board has to be 50% river conservation interests. The other 50% right now is sort of dominated by national laboratory scientists and other periphery hydropower industry people, but not hydropower owner-operators. They're not allowed to be on our governing board. But we have an advisory group of hydropower owners, and it puts us in this very unique middle ground where we have people on both sides who really appreciate and support what we do. We also have people on both sides that don't appreciate what we do. They don't agree either that hydropower could ever be low impact, or on the other hand,
Right.
that any hydropower isn't low impact. So but being in that middle space, that sort of gray space, balancing all of those interests, trying to come up with something that benefits everybody, that is sort of my happy space. And I would totally blame being a middle child on that. So
The middle child trying to be the most low impact of the children, maybe.
yeah, exactly.
Well, so that's a great kind of transition for if you could help us in the audience unpack what low impact means. Like, what is this referring to? And what impacts are we trying to minimize?
Yes, excellent question. So I will start by highlighting the fact that we do call it low impact, not no impact. So
Very important. Yes.
it is, and we have to acknowledge that hydropower does have an impact on anything. Also, so does every energy source. It's going to impact the environment, land, communities. It just, everything does. So what our organization did was to really assemble a big group of people, and it was people from the industry, environmental, river conservation, and energy market groups come together and hash out this definition. And the goal was to be as stringent as possible while also being achievable. Because if it's not stringent, it's not meaningful, but if it's not achievable, it's also not useful. So that was the goal. So the 8 areas that we focus on are water flows. So making sure that at a hydro facility, the water that is released from the facility is sufficient to sustain life. Water quality. Hydropower can have both a positive impact on water quality, but also a negative impact on water quality, and sort of depends on if you're upstream of the dam or below the dam. But that's a key thing that we look at. The most common water quality factor that we consider would be something like dissolved oxygen, which, if there's too much, it could kill fish. If there's not enough, it will kill fish. So you can optimize that water, the dissolved oxygen. So then we look at fish passage. We look at whether there are migratory fish that need to move upstream and whether they can do so in an effective manner. And then we also look at downstream where resident fish or migrating fish are able to pass safely and effectively. Then we look at shoreline protection. So especially with hydropower facilities that are able to peak, meaning that they'll store water over a period of time and then release it to time their generation with the market. That can create fluctuations in the reservoir that could cause erosion. And so we look at that component. Then we also look at threatened and endangered species. Often that's aquatic species, but it could also be land and avian species, and whether or not they're present and protected. And then we also look at cultural resource protection. So that, depending on what part of the country you're on, that could mean, in particular in the Northwest and the Southwest, it's around tribal resources, tribal wealth, and whether there are things that are present that need to be protected and access for tribes. And then, but if you're in sort of the Northeast, likely that cultural resources might even be the powerhouse itself or its mill buildings. So many of the hydropower facilities, at least in the Northeast, if not everywhere, they're 100 years old. They've been here for a long time, and they are beloved and protected. And then finally, we look at recreation. So we want to make sure that the public can access the river for recreational purposes. So that's sort of comprehensively, that's our definition of low impact hydropower.
Yeah, that is very thorough to cover all of the aspects, and maybe not even all, but majority, the big hitters of those aspects of of the environmental components, operational components, and the community side of those things. Well, so here in electric equity, we often think about people who do not yet have access to electricity. There's about 1 billion people on the planet with still some form of energy poverty. We know that the price of solar panels and lithium batteries are starting to come down, and these off-grid systems via solar are becoming much more feasible. But small-scale hydropower is still something that oftentimes can complement either solar-based microgrids or new developing microgrids in some ways. And so we were curious about your thoughts from like a zooming maybe outside of the United States into a global development component of what translates from the Low Impact Hydropower Institute to those types of applications.
Sure. Yeah. Hydropower is very unique in the renewable space because it can provide 24/7 renewable generation, and it is relied upon globally for balancing the grid and helping to integrate more intermittent renewables. So it's a super valuable renewable generation source. And there are rivers everywhere. So there's the potential for power everywhere. I think that especially micro hydro, I mean, it's improving. The technologies are improving. There are more turbines that can function at much lower flows and lower head than there have been in the past. So I think that's really exciting.
All right, so there's some jargon that's getting thrown around here. So just to clarify what some of these terms mean, we're talking about flow. We're talking about typically volumetric discharge, right? So cubic meters per second, that'd be the units that we're putting on those terms. And when we use the word head, for hydropower facilities, we are talking about the vertical drop, the potential energy that is present in that falling water, measured either in feet or meters. Those are the two variables that determine sizing for power potential or energy generation at these facilities.
But there's ways to do hydro now that it doesn't necessarily require a shore-to-shore dam to interrupt river flows. I think especially outside of the United States, which has a really heavy regulatory regime, it can be easier to build hydros that do benefit local communities because there is potentially less burdensome hurdles one has to go through to connect to a grid, which in the United States, it's really hard to do that. But if you're not worrying about that, then it's much easier to build an actual hydro in a local community that will provide energy to that community.
That's great because contextual application is so important with any energy system that's going to be pursued, right? And
Yes.
let alone, there are still some really significantly sized, huge hydropower projects that are posed to come online in the next 2 years, several thousand new large hydropower plants. And many of them are clustered in those river basins of high importance where, like you said, the biodiversity crisis is critical. Thinking about like the Amazon rainforest and the Mekong River Basin and the Congo River basins that have, 2,000 to 3,000 new projects planned in the coming decades. So just thinking about how we think about those is very different, but no less important for context.
Right. No, it's absolutely true. Well, we know anecdotally anyway that our definition can be super useful outside of any regulatory context to provide guidance on how you design a hydropower facility. So it can be implemented outside of any particular regulatory regime. I think, if I may muse for a moment, it is ideal if a community or a country could really think about what their energy needs are and how they wanted to implement those needs and how they're going to fulfill them, and have communities think about whether they want to be hosts to energy, to really kind of think about it in a proactive way and then invite developers in. That would be lovely. except it doesn't happen. It's usually communities responding to developers who are responding to other signals, that be it market signals or regulatory signals, leaving communities on the defensive, if you will. And it's, I think, a little harder to design a great system when that's the dynamic at play, but it's so often the dynamic at play.
Well, the word that came to mind, and maybe you disagree or this might be too aggressive of a word to use, but it seems like in those instances that the large energy developers could almost be seen as predatory, right? Looking for where the best option for their implementation that's going to lead to what their priorities are, whether that's profit or grid stability, which also is tied to profit, at the expense of community and environment.
Yes. I mean, I hesitate to call it predatory, but
Sure.
because but yes, developers are looking at whether there's a grid there that they can connect to, what the terrain is like, and the way that the U.S. regulatory regime works. There is no incentive to get community input before putting in a preliminary permit application. The developers are incentivized to put in that application, save your site, then go and talk to communities. And at that point, many times it puts the community on the defensive and it starts the relationship in a stressful way.
Certainly would. Well, thinking again, maybe broadly about both the environmental side of this and then the human conditions, but there's probably not a great easy answer to this, because if there was, we'd have the answer a long time ago. But in your view or the approach of LIHI, how do we balance long-term environmental protections on one hand, and then also on the other hand, this urgency, what we would call an urgency about human suffering regarding energy poverty and access? How do we think about that? How do we balance those things?
Yes. Well, I think one thing that's really important is that you can do both with a proper mindset and good design. You can go in and say, I'm going to solve this critical need of energy. I need energy generation in this area, but I'm going to do it in a way that protects the environment, that works around the local ecosystem, that considers the needs of the community. You can do both those things. It's just the intention to do it. So I kind of reject the premise, which people do bring up, is, we need to solve the climate crisis now. And so I need to build renewable energy now, despite the local ecosystem. That, setting that up as a trade-off. It doesn't have to be a trade-off. I don't think. You can design a good project that meets that critical need in a way that protects an ecosystem. I think it just takes thought and some creativity and intention and a real willingness to talk to the local communities and understand. They know the area best. They'll know where the critical species are. They'll know how to interact with them. And getting that input up front can really create a project that works best. And I think we have to be willing not to build a project in some favored area if it has catastrophic impacts on biodiversity or a community. I think we have to be willing to do that.
Yeah, instead of trying to force a square peg in a round hole of, well, this is what we've determined has the best energy potential, we're going to do it and mitigate, versus just deciding that this is not the best location and let's keep searching.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, do you have any examples or experiences that you can think of where something like this kind of putting the trade-off language aside and this strong environmental stewardship and improvements to energy access have been able to work well together? Some positive stories about that.
One of the ones that I'm aware of at the moment is not currently LIHI certified, but it's also not built yet. But Alaska is a wonderful example where they are super reliant on diesel and very much at the front lines of climate change. And there are communities there who are very thoughtfully designing hydro facilities that meet their energy needs, that are in geographic areas that, there are environmental impacts, but they are being mitigated. They are being designed in a way that is minimal impact, which is super exciting to see.
Hey, if you're interested to hear more about hydropower or off-grid systems in Alaska, recommend our previous episode to you where we talk with Amy, an electrical engineer working in Alaska and off-grid systems.
But in those projects, I do hear very much the intent from the beginning is we need this hydro, but we're going to do it in a way that is not going to cause severe damage. So that's a fun thing, as opposed to some other projects that, as you said before, Kayla, just go toward mitigating, minimizing the damage as opposed to optimizing the environmental outcome.
That's a pretty powerful phrase, I think, there of reframing it from mitigation to optimization. Because mitigation feels, at least in my understanding of it, fairly retroactive.
Yes.
And that's very significant in this space. Like you said, with an urgency of something like a climate crisis and needs for new, low carbon solutions and maintain energy resiliency of systems and continued electrification, the last thing we want is to be retroactive. That's
if
great.
I can throw in here even some of the hydropower technologies are evolving, and I love to call out Natel Energy. They designed a fish-friendly turbine, and unlike in the past where turbines are completely designed for efficiency, which makes sense, generation, yes, but Natel also prioritized making turbines that could do those things, but also would not kill fish. And again, it was like a mindset change, and they successfully did it and have adjusted things so that they sell their runners, which can be put into other turbines. And we see those being implemented now. But so it's just, that's an example of a change in mindset, of prioritizing the environment protection while achieving energy output and efficiency. It can be done, and it's super exciting to see.
Yeah, that's, I think, that intersection or the removing of silos between disciplines and sectors and passions, because that's where creativity happens and flourishes, I think. I would always show students we'd have sections about hydropower and low impact hydropower alternatives and options. And one of the things I'd always pull up a video of, in Alaska makes me think of this too, are the salmon cannons. I'm fascinated by salmon cannons. I love them. I think they're hilarious. And I always tell people to go, if you haven't seen this, don't know what I'm talking about, please look up a video of a salmon cannon. But those kinds of creative solutions for helping. I don't know if the fish feels like they're being helped at the time, but
I know. Well, as I understand, those studies were pretty positive. The fish did pretty well when they were passed up above the dam with those. Yes, that system is fabulous. And I don't know if you know this too, but it was adapted from agriculture.
Really?
Yep. I believe it was peaches, which are very delicate when you take them off the tree. And so this system was to collect the peaches in a very gentle fashion. Yeah, somebody was inspired and said, hey, we could use that to pass fish. And it does work, but we have not seen a big uptick in adoption of that technology. Resource agencies whose charge is to protect the environment, it's hard to want to be on the cutting edge of a technology like that because it feels very risky. What if it doesn't work? Maybe, what if it has the opposite effect? So I think, unfortunately, that technology has not caught on. But the different technologies to move fish upstream are quite varied. And they're everything from trapping and trucking. So you trap fish below the dam, put them on a truck, drive the truck above the dam, let them go. It can be very effective. Nature-like fishways are, I'd say, emerging as more common now, and that will provide both upstream and downstream passage pretty safely. and sometimes also allow for a recreational route, like a whitewater kayaking kind of pass through. So we'd love to see that too. We've got fish elevators, literal elevator, shove the fish in there below the dam, elevator goes up and releases them on the other side. I think fish passage, which is surprising to me every now and then I think about it, but fish passage has been around pretty much from the beginning of dam development, at least in the US. And it is still a very tricky situation that is not universally effective. It is a very hard thing to do right.
Seems to be another one of those that the context is extremely important of the physical facility, as well as the specific species of concern and the other geological components of that system, maybe the mode of operations of that system too, that all of that is highly contextual.
Yes, yes. And unfortunately, also have to be optimized for specific species, which is where the trade-offs and priorities come in, especially if you have salmon, you're probably going to have fish passage that prioritizes salmon's passage, but that may not work for a different species. And the eel are a very different thing altogether. They need a different kind of passage upstream and a different kind of passage downstream.
All right, here's some more jargon. So talking about run-of-river systems and then contrasting that with something called a peaking facility. So in the hydropower world, there's a category of organization for hydropower facilities called mode of operation. And mode of operation, there's several different types, there's several different configurations, and they can start to overlap, and it can start to get really complicated when you have very complex river systems with maybe multiple dams and multiple facilities, hydropower facilities, storage facilities across a river system. But we're going to simplify it here and just talk about the two main types of run-of-river versus a peaking facility. So a run-of-river facility, so these systems are not intending to store up water behind the dam. There is not a lake that is being formed. There might be a larger amount of water behind these facilities, especially if they are in a combination type of operation, but a true basic run-of-river facility, it is putting a barrier in place to pass water through turbines based upon the daily flow patterns. This helps to minimize, if that is how the system is truly operating, helps to minimize downstream effects to the river ecosystem because the daily and seasonal flow patterns are maintained. The vertical drop is based upon the landscape more so than necessarily creating a raised lake with a huge gravity dam. Run-of-river systems work really, really well with helping to meet base load of our electrical systems, our electrical grid demands at utility scale, talking about base load here. So sort of that lower foundational part of our electrical grid and our demands there, that's always present. We're contrasting this with a peaking hydropower facility, which tends to be typically where you have a large dam in place across a river, and it is storing water up behind that dam, flooding the upstream landscape and creating a very large lake with a very significant vertical drop. And so this type of facility might have some small turbines where they have constant releases, meeting a portion of base load on the electrical grid. But the true strength of something like a peaking hydropower facility is that you can open the floodgates on command to meet demands of the electrical grid. It is dispatchable power in a way, the same way that a lot of gas-fired power plants are called peaking plants. It helps to meet the peak electrical demands that we tend to have as regular patterns in our electrical systems. A hydropower facility designed as a peaking facility can help meet those demands very, very well.
Run-of-river facilities, they pass the water that comes to them. So that sort of ensures that the flow is steady. It's more like a natural flow of the river. And it certainly eliminates the erosion issue of reservoirs that are constantly rising and lowering and rising and lowering. That said, there are ways to do environmentally optimizing storage at hydros. And I would point out things like very flashy rivers that have super high times and super low times. And run-of-river can have the effect of mitigating those flashpoints. So it can be just sort of more calm all the time, which itself is not necessarily the natural flow of the river. So I would just, again, yes, run-of-river makes sense, and it has, in many ways, fewer impacts. On the other hand, you can have a peaking facility that can sort of mirror a flashy river system and sort of accomplish both things. So just going back to it's very site specific. We've certified facilities that are peaking facilities because they are able to meet our criteria regardless, and they're not creating big erosion, etc. But we've also rejected run-of-river facilities that, despite the fact of being run-of-river, can't meet our criteria.
I have encountered from just folks in general, us as humans tend to think that a system being flashy or floods happening is always bad. And that comes from a human perspective of it's bad because we put people stuff in the way of rivers. Some rivers, that is their natural function. And those are part of regular healthy rhythms of an ecosystem to have regular floods or to be a flashy system. It's when you change a system that's not flashy into a flashy, or a system that is flashy into a more constant flow, that the effect on the environment is there different from its baseline.
Yes. And there was certainly in the U.S. a regulatory trend toward run-of-river facilities. I think we saw a lot of conversion of that in the last wave of licensing a few decades ago. But now I have a feeling that that's going to change. We're on the eve of another wave of hydropower relicensing. And the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that oversees hydropower licensing has made statements that grid balancing, grid stability, integrating renewables is more important than ever, and signaled, from my perspective, a willingness to shift away from run-of-river as a default and allow for more storage. So we'll see how that goes.
The last question that I have for us is one of the things that we tend to ask people at the end of all of these conversations. Of this is an opportunity to share one's voice about the issues that they're passionate about. So kind of opening it up to you, is there anything that we should have asked that we didn't? Anything else that you want the audience to know? What message would you like to share?
I guess I would just go back, especially if we're thinking about an international context, that hydropower is a really good renewable resource that provides a lot of really important benefits, both to developed countries with big grids and potentially to local, behind the meter, if you will, communities. But to not assume that having hydro is going to wreck an ecosystem, that it can be done thoughtfully in a way that won't. And I think that's what I would just like to emphasize with folks, is just you can design a facility that optimizes its environmental protections. And I just would encourage people to be thoughtful about it and to reach out if we can help. We consult with a lot of people all the time. So we'd love to answer questions and talk to people and come visit your school.
Thank you so much for your time and for your, as we will call it, expertise in this space of between the environmental needs and the energy systems that are critical for our world's development and function. So again, let's just connect some dots here of why our podcast, Electric Equity, is talking about hydropower. We're doing a lot of conversation in this interview about the environment, and because it is based on flowing water and river ecosystems, of course, we're going to be talking about the environment. And how does this connect to something like energy access for the energy poor? Starting at the highest level, we believe in electric equity and this work that we're doing, and hopefully you, the audience, also isn't too far from being convinced that energy access is essential to improving quality of life and for helping with human flourishing, and is part of helping people achieve human dignity. Some of the easiest ways that our global society, has achieved energy access in the developed world is through fossil fuel development, and that has been a great strength of our systems. And so that is the roadmap that many of places that are trying to develop energy access are attempting to follow. Hydropower has been on the forefront of the renewable energy landscape for the longest time, and there's a lot of hydropower development going on globally as well, both to supplement fossil fuel dominated electrical grids, but also to lead the way in a renewable energy transition as fossil fuels become more scarce, more volatile, and as our climate has responses to accumulated carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So this hydropower boom that we really see happening even today and happening in places that are still in critical need of energy access is essential. That's why we're talking about this in this podcast, and so grateful for Shannon's experience in the environmental impacts and how we can do hydropower appropriately. It is very applicable in many of the scenarios that we are concerned about here, where there is energy poverty, needs for energy access. It's dispatchable. It has some strengths of grid integration. It has strengths in compatibility with other technologies like solar and wind, and with our modern grid applications can be scaled to a whole lot of different sizes. But ultimately, like with any type of technology, we have to be careful of how we use it and wield it well.
Electric Equity explores global expressions of energy poverty, its impact on real people, and ways it's being alleviated. For more information about an episode, or to support us financially, visit our website at justiceandmercy.energy. I'm your host, Brian Thomas.